Good evening. Welcome to the Community Library live stream. I'm Martha Williams, Programs and Education Manager here at the library. Tonight we welcome the library's current writer-in-residence at the historic Ernest and Mary Hemingway House, Nancy Sindelar. Nancy has spent over 30 years in education as a teacher, administrator, university professor, and consultant, and she has published numerous articles and 3 books on educational topics. She is also the author of Influencing Hemingway, a biography of Ernest Hemingway inspired by her time teaching in Oak Park, Illinois, and written to document how Hemingway's early years and the people and places he was drawn to in his adult life contributed to his thoughts, actions, and writing. We have Nancy's book here in our Hemingway collection, which you can explore in the Betty Olson Carr Reading Room, and I'd invite you all to come check it out, along with the many other Hemingway materials held by the library's Jean Roger Lane Center for Regional History. The largest Hemingway holding in our collection is, of course, his final home, which Nancy will be talking a little bit about tonight as she guides us through Papa's Places. Since 2019, part of the private home has been dedicated to a residency program hosting fiction writers, poets, historians, and academics, as well as photographers, musicians, and scientists. Like the library, we hope the home is a place of lifelong wonder, quiet escape, and spirited collaboration between creative spirits and our community. In this time of the pandemic, the residents who have joined us over the last year have truly gotten to enjoy a retreat, but they have also contributed to the lifeblood of our community by sharing their work and lives with us, safely and virtually. Nancy is a longstanding friend of the library and of Sun Valley, having presented at several of our Ernest Hemingway seminars in the past, and as a local herself years ago. So we have been so happy to welcome her back for her residency this month, and we welcome her to the community library this evening.
Thank you, Martha. It's wonderful to be back in Sun Valley and Ketchum, and of course a thrill to be able to live at the Hemingway home. So many thanks to the community library for establishing the residency program, and as I said, it's an honor to be part of it. So tonight we're going to take a visit to Papa's Places, and Hemingway had a long and complex life, so I'm just going to be talking about his homes. This isn't advancing. If we consider Hemingway's life, he really was a citizen of the world. So he starts out in Oak Park. He goes into Italy during World War I. He comes back to Chicago and Toronto. Then he moves on to France, Switzerland, Spain, goes to Key West, goes to Cuba, and then comes back to Ketchum. So the first slide here, I'm going to be talking about his birthplace home. So this was the home that was built by his grandparents, Ernest and Caroline Hall. And Ernest and Caroline had a daughter, Grace, who was Hemingway's mother. So this is a typical Queen Anne home. And at the time that Hemingway lived in Oak Park Avenue was lined with homes such as this. So what makes it a Queen Anne style? Part of it is the lack of symmetry of the facade. You can see it's very asymmetrical. It has a turret, which is characteristic of the Queen Anne homes. And it also has a texture to it. Part of the house is shingles, part of the house is clapboard, and then it has that beautiful porch, which happens to be facing south, so that the residents could enjoy the sun in the summertime. When Ernest was born, his mother and his father and his grandfather were living in that house. And what happened was that Caroline and Ernest Hall were living there with Grace and her brother. And then Caroline became ill. But across the street was a young doctor by the name of Clarence Hemingway. And he came over to the house and would help take care of Caroline Hemingway, or Caroline Hall. And in the process, he started to court Grace Hall. Well, eventually, Caroline died, and Clarence married Grace. So at that time, Clarence moved into this house, and Clarence and Grace eventually had 6 children. Ernest was the second of 6 children. He was born in this room. Now, Clarence turned out to be an obstetrician. He was head of obstetrics at Oak Park Hospital, but he was present at the birth, but he didn't actually deliver Ernest. But this is the room where Ernest was born. Here he is. He's about 18 months old, and his mother kept a memory book, which has been a wonderful resource for scholars. And so she would write down things that Ernest would say as a child. And so very early on, he told his mother that he was afraid of nothing. Here's the family with the first 4 of the 6 children. So Dr. Clarence Hemingway is there in the middle with Grace's mother, and then Ernest is on his other side with then the three sisters in front. So Dr. Hemingway had his office in the home, and in the home there were specimen jars. One had a human fetus, and in the closet there was a skeleton. And the kids called the skeleton Susie Bonaparte. This is the interior of the house, and on the right side of the slide, you see the parlor. And Ernest's mother, Grace, was a very talented musician. She gave vocal lessons, and she created a family orchestra. So the Hemingway children played songs from simple sonatas, from current musicals, and every family member had an instrument. Ernest happened to be playing the cello. The other room that you see here is the library, and the library was filled with classics: Shakespeare, Dickens, Thackeray, and the children were expected to be reading or doing something purposeful all the time. Ernest and his older sister Marceline were very close, and in Marceline's letters, she writes that once that she and Ernest were home with the mumps, and during that time they read all of Shakespeare's tragedies. This is Ernest Hall's bedroom, so this would have been Abba, Grandpa's bedroom, and he died in this house and was waked in this house when Ernest was about 6 years old. He died of Wright's disease. So, if you look at Ernest's novels, he's always focusing on death and how people face death. And so at a very young age, he saw his grandfather die and then his father being waked in the parlor of the home. When Ernest Hall died, Grace took her inheritance and decided to build her dream home. She'd been living in that house since she was 15 years old, and she wanted something new. So she sketched out this house, which is also now in Oak Park, and she burned all the old things in the house, got new furniture, got rid of that Victorian furniture, and built this house. And so this is the boyhood home. Now, you can see that the house is very close to her sketch. She did have an architect by the name of Fidelki, who obviously helped her design the house and build the house. But you also can see the influence of a very important neighbor in this house, and that is Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright lived in Oak Park about the same time as the Hemingways. He was there from 1889 to 1909. So this house was built in about 1906. A lot of research has been done as did the Wrights know the Hemingways, and no one has really come up with a clear answer to that. But Wright was building homes that were very, very different from what the Hemingway or the Hall Hemingway house had been. And you can see the Wright influence, even though this wasn't designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, you can see Wright's influence in this house. It has the broad eaves, it has the horizontal banding, it's stucco instead of all those textures, and it's very horizontal. The Midwest, unlike Ketchum, is very flat. And so Wright talked about the prairie style and tried to make the houses fit into the landscape more so than those Queen Anne or those Victorian houses did. So here's Ernest with his mother and his grandmother and a sibling standing on the stairs of that house. And, you know, what's interesting is that, so Ernest was raised by both of his parents who were very well educated. The father was a medical doctor. The mother was a trained singer for opera. And Ernest's paternal grandparents were both graduates of Wheaton College. And everyone was very much involved with having a good education and being serious and being active. In the Hemingway home, there was no card playing, no drinking, no smoking, no dancing. And when those children did something wrong, they were told to bend down on their knees and ask God for forgiveness. That was the environment in which Ernest Hemingway grew up. So he grew up with a strict set of rules, and when you think about his literature, he's always looking for rules for behavior and how to move forward. This is grandfather and grandmother Hemingway, so his paternal grandparents. They're standing in front of that Kenilworth Avenue home, the boyhood home. And the grandfather, Anson, has just finished marching in the Oak Park Memorial Day Parade. And what's interesting, if you look closely at this slide, is that grandfather Anson is very proud of the fact that he is a veteran of the Civil War. And he's wearing his medals and his Civil War hat. So at this time, Ernest is about 16 years old. And as we know now, war was a very important detail in Hemingway's life. And it was grandfather Anson that influenced Hemingway about the importance of war. This is how men show courage. This is how men show valor. And please note that grandfather Anson has his medals and his hats many, many years after the Civil War. And we'll see that Ernest has the same tendency to do the same thing, to hang on to his uniforms. So Ernest spent the school year part of the school year in Oak Park, but the summers were spent at Walloon Lake, and the family had a cottage there. And this is where he learned to hunt and to fish. And these were activities that, as we know, he enjoyed his entire life. It was a 2-room cottage, and Ernest frequently slept in a tent. Here he is with 2 of his siblings sitting with his feet in Walloon Lake. And of course, his father was up there too. And this area was surrounded with Indian camps because there was a huge logging industry going on then. And occasionally, Dr. Hemingway would go into the Indian camps and perform pro bono medical work. And of course, that comes out in Ernest's story, Indian Camp. Dr. Hemingway also was pretty adventuresome. This is the family boat, and it's Dr. Clarence Hemingway with Ernest, and they're going out and they use the boat for fishing. But Dr. Hemingway also used to put all the kids in the boat, rock it, and say, "All right now, swim to shore." So, he taught his children to be very self-sufficient, and certainly he taught Ernest to be a good marksman and to love fishing and to love the outdoors. Here's Ernest, about 3 years old, with his gun. Here he is with his father back in Illinois, and they're practicing at a local game farm. Here he is fishing up in Hortons Creek. And here he is with his mother. Now, Grace Hall Hemingway really embraced this whole outdoors life. And a lot of women of her day would not have gone up there. It's a pretty rugged environment. And I think it was largely because of her that Ernest really enjoyed hunting and fishing, because he went up there every summer from the time he was born until he was 18 years old. And Grace caught that fish. So good for Grace. I mean, she really bought into the program and gave certainly Ernest an interest in hunting and fishing that lasted his entire life. He's about 18 years old in this picture. So because Clarence was a doctor and an obstetrician, he had one of the first cars in Oak Park. But because he was also adventuresome, he took this car to Michigan the summer that Ernest graduated from high school, the summer of 1917. Now, all those people didn't go in the car. It was Clarence, Grace, Ernest, and his little brother, Lester. And at that time, there weren't highways, there weren't gas stations, and the family slept in tents overnight on the side of the road. And Ernest had a rake in the back of the car so that he could pull, and a winch so that he could pull the car out of the sandy roads of Michigan if it became lodged in the sand. So it took them 4 days and 5 nights to get from Oak Park up to Walloon Lake, but they did it in this car. And I like this picture of Ernest because he's just graduated from high school. He's wearing his high school letter sweater, and he's got that look about him like, yeah, I just graduated from high school, and aren't I cool? So it's the Oak Park High School letter sweater, and I'll show you some pictures of his sports involvement in a minute. This is Walloon Lake. Lovely, beautiful, peaceful lake, wonderful spot for a boy to spend summers. This is the cottage, the way it looks today. That slide on the right is an outhouse, and his nephew, Ernest Mainland, died recently, but Ernest Mainland lived in that house, and like Ernest Hemingway, he had a pretty good sense of humor. So there's a sign on the outhouse that says, Ernest Hemingway sat here. This is Ernest Mainland, and you can see he has the family name of Ernest, and he looks a little bit like Ernest Hemingway. And the cottage, based on that English tradition of the Halls and the Hemingways, was called Windermere. These are some pictures of the Indian camps that were around the house and the logging that went on. And, this becomes one of those influences on Hemingway's literature. And so there is that short story of the Indian camp where Nick goes with his father to the Indian camp where a Native American woman is trying to deliver a baby. And this is what the Indian camps looked like. So Ernest would have experienced that also. All right, so he also went to a very comprehensive high school, Oak Park High School, graduated in 1917. And this is what the school looked like when Ernest was there. That facade is still there today. The school is larger, and it still is a wonderful, comprehensive high school. And as I said, the Hemingway family didn't tolerate just sitting around, and Ernest was able to take advantage of all the activities at that high school. So here he is on the football team, the swimming team, Burt Club, which is like a debating society, Rifle Club. They don't have that one anymore. He was in the school play, Beau Brummel, so that's Ernest center stage with a powdered wig. Had he not been on stage, he would have been in the pit orchestra playing his cello. And here he is as an actor. He also had the opportunity to write when he was in high school. Tabula was the name of the literary magazine, and he published 3 short stories before he graduated. He was also editor of the school newspaper. And, you know, the themes, when you read his high school writing, which I've had the opportunity to do, you can tell it was written by a 16-year-old. But his themes of violence, death, the outdoors, Indians as renegade spirits come through in that literature. And in his newspaper articles, his sense of humor comes through. So he has this column in the Oak Park High School newspaper called Highlights and Lowlights. And in that column, he says, Mr. Larson entertained his 7th period commercial law class at a slumber party last Tuesday. What every teacher wants to hear. He was the editor of the school newspaper. And, you know, he had a teacher his senior year in high school, Fanny Briggs, who ran her classroom like a newspaper office. Someone was the editor, someone wrote the sports articles, everyone had a job. And Ernest, I think, thought of her as one of his favorite teachers. He wrote columns, and of course he was on the football team, so I know you can't read this slide, but he's describing a football game in which he's playing. So there's a lot about Hemingway making touchdowns in the article that Hemingway wrote. This is the page from his yearbook when he graduated, and I won't go into it tonight, but he and Marceline went through school at the same time and graduated together. So they're on the same page of the high school yearbook. But you can see their list of accomplishments compared to the other 2 students who are on that same page. The Hemingway children were raised with very high expectations and were put in an environment where they really could act on them. And I think that had a huge impact on Hemingway's life. After graduation, his parents very much wanted him to go to college, but he didn't want to go. And he was able to land a job with the help of his uncle at the Kansas City Star. And so he was a cub reporter using his background from his high school journalism class. And it was there he became interested in or actually required to use the Kansas City style book. And Pete Wellington gave him the style book and, you know, said that Ernest was always looking for the action. He was hanging out at the police station. He was hanging out at the hospital. He wanted to have an opportunity to write stories that involved action. And so certainly going to Kansas City, which sometimes is known as the city where boys become men, broadened Hemingway's world. And he continues to do that. I think of his life as just a series of concentric circles where he keeps reaching out and reaching out and reaching out. So these are some of the guidelines from the Kansas City Style Book. And you can see that they had an influence on his writing later on. He didn't stay in Kansas City very long, however, because the Red Cross came through and they were looking for people who wanted to volunteer to be ambulance drivers in Italy during World War I. And Ernest jumped at the chance. He had tried to enlist, but his eyesight prevented him from joining the Army. And so when he was able to join as a Red Cross volunteer, he jumped at the chance. So he goes back to Oak Park. He says goodbye to his family. He says goodbye to his journalism teacher. And then he heads to Italy. So here he is driving an ambulance during World War I. And I have looked at this picture very closely, but this is in Fasalta di Piave. This is the town where he was stationed. And this is the experience on which A Farewell to Arms is based. And if you look at this picture, you can see that it's rainy and muddy, and that's the way it's described in A Farewell to Arms, too. Ernest's job was to take cigarettes and chocolate down to troops in the trenches. And while he was in a trench, the trench was hit with an Austrian shell. One of the men was killed immediately. Another had his legs blown off. Ernest grabbed the third, dragged him to safety, but while he was running back to safety, he was hit in the back of his legs with machine gun fire. So he wound up in the Red Cross hospital. And this is where he met his first love, Agnes von Kurowski. And they dated for a while, and he actually thought that they were going to get married. But when he gets back to Oak Park, he gets this Dear John letter, which is just absolutely painful to read. He's thinking they're going to get married someday. She writes, she calls him a boy, and tells him that she's going to marry someone else, but says she hopes he'd have a wonderful career. He told her he wanted to be a writer, and that someday he would show what a man you really are. So poor Ernest, what does he do? His friends are in college. He's been jilted by the woman he loves. He goes back to Michigan, and he gives a talk at the Petoskey Library. And he has one of these chance meetings. We've all had them in our lives where you're not planning on it, but you meet someone that turns out to be important in your life. And there he met Mrs. Harriet Conable, who invited him to spend time in Toronto with her disabled son. And as a result of that experience, he does go to Toronto, and he has the opportunity to write a few articles that winter for the Toronto Star. That becomes important in his life later on. After the winter in Toronto, he comes back to Chicago, meets Hadley Richardson. They get married. They live in Chicago. Ernest has a job. He has a wife. They have an apartment. Ernest's parents are very happy. And then he gets this letter from the Toronto Star. Would he like to be a foreign correspondent? Well, he jumps at the chance. He breaks his lease, quits his job, and he and Hadley go off to Paris. So this is where they live in Paris. It's in a working class section of Paris. They live above a dance hall. I took this picture. It's 4 stories up a spiral staircase. Their bathroom is a slop jar and a pitcher and a Turkish toilet in the hallway. The kitchen is a 2-burner gas stove. But Ernest is very happy with Hadley, and he writes back to his parents, who are still living in Oak Park, that this apartment is the jolliest place you've ever seen. He writes during the day in the cafes along the Boulevard Montparnasse. So he wrote at La Closerie. He spent time at La Rotonde. And, you see this pattern, and he kept it his entire life, where he lives in two places. He did this as a boy. It was Oak Park and Walloon Lake. And when he's in Paris, it's Paris, and then they go to Switzerland. And this is where he learns to ski and to sled. So they take the train from Gare Lyon in Paris down to Lausanne. From Lausanne, they go to Chambly. And then from Chambly, they go to Les Avants, which is this little ski run in Switzerland. And here that quote comes from something he wrote for the Toronto Star. But he is experimenting with bobsledding. So that's Ernest in the back of the bobsled. And of course, back then, no one wore a helmet, but somehow he survived. And here he moves on. He later skis with others and goes to Austria. Well, Hadley becomes pregnant, and they go back to Toronto. Ernest gets a full-time job. They live in this apartment that has electricity, running water. It even has a bathtub, but they hate it. They want to go back to Paris. And when Ernest gets the assignment to write about a new white peacock at the Toronto Zoo, he goes, "We're out of here. I've had it." He quits the job at the Toronto Star, and they go back to Paris. Now, they were struggling when they were there the first time. Now they're really struggling because Ernest has quit his job, and Hadley does have a small trust fund, but they are really working hard to make ends meet. So they live, again, near the Boulevard Montparnasse on Notre-Dame-des-Champs. And this time, they are living above a sawmill with a baby. So in this picture, you see Hadley, Ernest, and John Hemingway, who eventually wound up in Ketchum. But there he is in Paris, and his parents called him Bumby. So this material behind Hadley is lumber, so it's not a great place for a writer. Here's Ernest, or Bumby, Jack, with his godmother, Gertrude Stein, in Luxembourg Garden. And Gertrude Stein, of course, was a big influence on Hemingway early in his career, and she introduced him to a lot of other artists. So though Ernest didn't go to college, here he was in Paris, and at the same time there's T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Fitzgerald, Picasso, Miro, and he had this amazing group of friends, and they were pretty much pulled together by Gertrude Stein. Ezra Pound was part of that group, and he lived on the same street as Hadley and Ernest. And Pound also influenced Hemingway's writing. Another person he met in Paris was Robert McAlmon, and McAlmon introduces Hemingway to Spain, which of course becomes an amazing experience for Hemingway because this is where he learns to love the bullfight. And so they go to the Festival of San Fermain, and this becomes, of course, the background for The Sun Also Rises. And it's The Sun Also Rises that really catapults Ernest Hemingway to fame. This is an interesting picture because here we see Hadley, Ernest, and here's Pauline Pfeiffer, Mrs. Hemingway number 1, Mrs. Hemingway number 2. Pauline is in Paris to cover fashion shows for Vogue, and she has her eye out for Hemingway, but she gets to him by befriending Hadley. Eventually, Hadley and Ernest divorce, and Ernest marries Pauline, and this is when he converts to Catholicism. And Pauline is very wealthy. Her family owns Warner Pharmaceuticals, Richard Hudnut Cosmetics, and she has a very substantial income. So they move to this apartment, and this is close to Luxembourg Gardens. It's not that far from where he lived above the sawmill, but it's in a totally different kind of neighborhood. And so they have a living room, a dining room, and he has a study. So very different situation for Ernest. Eventually, he decides he wants to leave Paris, and John Dos Passos has convinced him that he should go to Key West. They live in apartments for a while, and then Pauline's uncle, Gus, buys them this house in Key West. And this is a Spanish colonial house, 2 stories. It has a wrought iron terrace around 4 sides of the house. And, you know, Key West is very hot, very humid. So the house is characterized by very high ceilings, tall windows. Everything is aligned so that the breeze comes in. But Key West is a tough environment, and certainly very different for Pauline than Paris. But she gives it her all. So she renovates the house. She puts crystal chandeliers in the living room, the bedroom, the dining room. A lot of tile on the floors and in the walkways, and has her furniture brought from Paris. This is the bedroom. And Ernest transforms the carriage house into a study. So Ernest was able to really concentrate just on his writing during the Key West years. Pauline pretty much took care of the bills. And so this was a time when he finished A Farewell to Arms. He wrote To Have and to Have Not. They took trips. They went to Spain and, you know, revisited the bullfights, which resulted in Death in the Afternoon. They took a safari. So, you know, the boy that learned to hunt in Michigan suddenly is on a safari in Africa. And he loved the experience. He also buys a boat during this time. This is the Pilar. It's a 38-foot fishing boat made in Brooklyn by Wheeler. And the fish in the Gulf of Mexico at that time were plentiful and huge. So if you notice this picture, there are 3 boys there. It's Ernest, Pauline, and then Jack, and then the 2 boys he had with Pauline, Gregory, and Patrick. Ernest has a little side interest in Cuba. He has now met Jane Mason, who lives in Cuba, so he goes over there on a regular basis, and he stays at the Ambos Mundos Hotel. So this becomes another one of his places. In Key West, if you have the opportunity to go there, you'll want to go to the Custom House. And, you know, I mentioned how his grandfather kept his uniform. In the Custom House Museum, you can see Ernest's uniform for when he was an ambulance driver during World War I. It's there. He also spent time at this bar called Sloppy Joe's. And again, he's a great storyteller. He loves people, but he's broadening his circle of friends. And so he meets sailors, he meets fishermen, and he meets Cuban millionaires. So Key West was a very prosperous town at the turn of the century because of shipwrecks and salvaging, and then during the 20s because of Prohibition. And so it was an interesting place for Hemingway to live. And of course, this was where he wrote To Have and to Have Not. He was pretty well known at Sloppy Joe's, and this is also where Martha Gellhorn showed up one evening in a black dress, and she became Mrs. Hemingway number 3. So Ernest, most people would say, gee, Ernest Hemingway has a boat. He can devote all of his time to writing. he has a wife that's willing to kind of fund the family endeavors, but he's bored. And he gets a job through the North American Newspaper Alliance, and much to Pauline's dismay, goes off to the Spanish Civil War to cover the Spanish Civil War for the North American Newspaper Alliance. Martha Gellhorn is, of course, with him. She goes too. So here they are in Spain, and he, at this time, meets Russian writers. Ernest is supporting the Republican or the Loyalist cause, which is also supported by Communist Russia. So that becomes a problem later on in his life because he does get to know these other communist writers. So Pauline eventually divorces Ernest on the grounds of desertion, and he marries Martha Gellhorn. They have what Martha called a working honeymoon, and they go to China. Both of them have journalism assignments. Unlike the first two Mrs. Hemingways, Martha was very devoted to her career. So at that time, she was a journalist for Collier's and did a lot of writing for them. She's the one that finds the Finca Villa, Lookout Farm, in San Francisco de Palos, Cuba, which is a beautiful Spanish colonial home, and she begins to renovate it. This is the living room, and it's filled with furniture pretty much made in Cuba. So you see different kinds of furniture there than you certainly do in his other homes. Part of it would be like these rattan chairs, which is typical of Cuban furniture because it's so hot and humid there that you need to have furniture that breathes and is comfortable. Like all the other Hemingway homes, you see animal trophies on the walls and lots of books. So this is the interior of the living room. So in the chair is Bumby, or Jack Hemingway, and Patrick is looking over his shoulder. This is the dining room. Eventually, Mary Hemingway, wife number 4, gets involved with Finca Villa, and she builds this tower for him to write, although he never really wrote there, but it's there, and it has a beautiful view out to the Gulf of Mexico. This is his Corona typewriter, which was a gift to him from Hadley, and it's the one on which he wrote Sun Also Rises. This is his study. There are about 4,000 books in this house, and at the time now, the scholars are going through the books and looking at his annotations. And Ernest wrote standing up, so you can see that on that bookshelf there is the typewriter, and there's a bed in that room. Now, that's not the master bedroom where he slept, but when his back would start to bother him after he wrote for a while, he would lie down on that bed. This is the bathroom connected with that part of the house. And on the wall there by the scale, he has written his blood pressure and his weight. And as time goes on, his health begins to deteriorate. And you can see that even during the Cuba years, he's keeping track of his weight and his blood pressure. And eventually he's taking medicine for high blood pressure. This is his closet. So I've had the opportunity to go in all of Hemingway's homes, and I look around and I look in the closet, and lo and behold, what do I find? Here's his uniform it says War Correspondent. This is the one he wore when he went to France during World War II as a war correspondent. So like his grandfather, he hung on to his uniforms. Another important place for Hemingway was Cojimar, which is where he kept his boat. And this is in Cuba. So here he is with his crew, Gregorio Fuentes. And this was the setting for Old Man in the Sea. And, in the Old Man in the Sea, they talk about the terrace restaurant. this is it. It's the only place in Kohimar, but there is Hemingway. All those bottles behind him in the bar are all rum, different kinds of rum. The photo on the right is a fort at the entrance to the harbor at Kohimar. Most of the harbors in Cuba have forts because there was always this fear of pirates, because at one time Cuba was so rich with gold and sugar cane. And the fellow on the left, I always try to meet people that knew Hemingway, and he said he fished with Hemingway as a boy. We weren't able to talk very much. His English wasn't very good, and my Spanish wasn't very good. But he was happy to see me, and I was happy to see him. More fishing pictures. So Hemingway was adored in Kohimar, and when he died, the fishermen took their propellers from their boats and their anchors, they melted them down, and they made this statue of Hemingway with this sort of classical surrounding. And, you know, it really shows that the stature of him in this little town, because these people are very simple. They have very few resources, but they made this bust of him. I was there in 2011. I was one of 2 Americans at the conference in Havana, and was given the opportunity to place the flowers at the statue on his birthday. Old Man of the Sea was filmed in Kohimar, and Spencer Tracy played the role of Old Man. And so here they are actually in Havana. So you see Jack, Hemingway, Spencer Tracy, Ernest, and Mary. Today, the Hemingway legend for fishing still lives on in Key West. There's a Hemingway bill fishing tournament. He started it in 1960. Now, the revolution was in 1959, so guess who won the tournament in 1960? In this picture, I think, is the only time that Hemingway and Castro actually were together, but it's in every hotel in Havana. You would think that Hemingway and Castro, you know, spent every day and every night together, which I don't think is the case. But Hemingway did sponsor the tournament and the trophy, and he awarded the trophy to Fidel Castro. When Hemingway got news of winning the Pulitzer Prize for Old Man on the Sea, I think it was so wonderful. He was on his boat when it happened, and this was before email or cell phones or computers, and he got the news on his transoceanic, which he listened to very diligently, that he had won the Pulitzer. During the time he was in Cuba, he also left Cuba and was involved as a war correspondent during World War II. So Martha Gellhorn, wife number 3, was already in France doing work for Collier's, and she kept writing these letters back to Ernest in Cuba saying, "You've got to come over here. This is where all the action is." And so eventually he does go to Cuba, go to France, and he's on Omaha Beach for D-Day. But when Ernest Hemingway gets to France, Collier's fires Martha because Ernest is a male and can go into war zones, and Martha can't. So their marriage was pretty shaky at that point, but that transfer of power there was the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. He is involved in D-Day, and then later on he flies into France and takes a group of soldiers from Rambouillet and leads them into Paris for the liberation of Paris. Now, when the American soldiers got to Paris for the liberation of Paris, there was this huge march down the Champs-Élysées, and everyone was excited that, Paris was liberated. Hemingway, however, was in the Ritz bar, and he told his friends that he was going to liberate the Ritz. So while his colleagues were marching down the Champs-Élysées, he was buying champagne for everyone in the Ritz bar in Paris. Here he is. He had gone back and forth to the Ritz quite a bit later on as he became more affluent. So here he is with Charles Ritz, the founder's son, at the Ritz Hotel. And you think, what does Ernest Hemingway have in common with Charles Ritz? Well, it was fishing. They both liked to fish. In fact, Charles Ritz calls the main dining room l'espadon, which means swordfish. Hemingway also spent time in the bar. He liked to talk to Bertin, the bartender, and get information about the horse races. This is the Hemingway Bar today, and it's filled with Hemingway pictures and Hemingway nostalgia, and very friendly to Hemingway scholars. So during the years in Cuba, he always came to Sun Valley and to Ketchum to hunt and to just get away from the heat and the humidity. So his first trip to the Sun Valley Ketchum area was in 1939. And he loved to duck hunt. And Hemingway was invited to stay free at the lodge because Jean Van Gelder felt that a renowned author and sportsman would help publicize the new resort. So here he is with another star, Gary Cooper, and Hemingway and Cooper, or Coops as he called him, were great friends. I think the woman in the middle is Tilly Arnold, but I'm not sure. After World War II, Martha and Ernest separated, and he met Mary Hemingway in London during World War II. So when the war was over, Mary and Ernest were married in Havana and then went back and forth between Cuba and Sun Valley. So here they are out in front of the lodge. They also took trips to Italy. And Ernest was always attracted to women, and the women were attracted to him. So lo and behold, when he's almost 50 years old, he gets this crush on this 19-year-old girl, and her name is Adriana Ivancic. He met her at her father's game farm in Venice, and he just becomes infatuated with her. He invites her back to Cuba, so here they are at the Floridita. And I mean, this picture is worth 1,000 words. It's in my book, but here's Mary. She's sort of pretending this isn't going on. This is Adriana's mother who comes over to chaperone her daughter. And here's Hemingway, and here's Adriana. They also go back. He wants to kind of relive some of his adventures, which turn out to be not so terrific. They go back for a second safari, and he's in 2 plane crashes. Mary is with him, and he suffers concussions. And then the series of events that lead up to the purchase of the Ketchum Home are sort of interesting. Because of Hemingway's involvement in the Spanish Civil War, he is aware of a revolution brewing in Cuba. And he's feeling sort of pressured to have a second home in the United States. And he's certainly getting a lot of reinforcement from the United States government to do that. So this is when he buys the Ketchum Home. And I imagine, as the audience knows, this was originally built by Bob Topping. And it is similar in look to the Sun Valley Lodge. And it turns out that the architect for the Topping home found the molds for the Sun Valley Lodge and used them in this house. So unlike the Queen Anne house, unlike the Spanish colonial houses, here is a very mid-century American home, and Hemingway and Mary purchased it in 1959, the house and all the furniture. And the furniture came from Hollywood because it was the Toppings furniture. There are stamps in the home. There was a Cuba stamp and a U.S. stamp. And, you know, it's interesting. Wherever you go, Hemingway is claimed as, well, he's ours. I mean, you come to Ketchum and everyone is so happy to talk about Hemingway. But you go to Cuba and it's like, well, he's not an American writer. He's Cuban. He's ours. He lived here for 22 years. And that's longer than he lived anyplace else. So there is also a stamp for Hemingway in Cuba. And you'll notice that it has a swordfish on it. The time he was in the Ketchum home were kind of difficult days for Hemingway. He was suffering from depression. His father also suffered from depression. And he was taking a lot of medication. Mary and his Ketchum doctor decided he should go to the Mayo Clinic, and he had electric shock therapy there, and that erased his memory, and that really increased his depression because, as you can see from just the little bit I've said about his literature was very experiential. He wrote about the places and the things that he knew, and when he couldn't access his memory anymore, that was really very difficult for him. The Bay of Pigs was in April of 1961, and after that, he pretty much believed that he wouldn't be going back to Cuba, which is where his manuscripts were, his art collection, his book collection, and he loved that house in San Francisco de Paolo. And then in May, his good friend Gary Cooper died, all in May of 1961. So this is the Mayo Clinic where he had the electric shock therapy. And he pretty much convinced the doctors in his last treatment that he was okay, that he was going to go back to Ketchum, to the Ketchum house, and do his exercises and follow his routine. But he really was kind of tricking the doctor. On the evening of July 1st, he and Mary had dinner at the Christiana restaurant. And, you know, we know from talking to waiters and waitresses there, he had a bottle of wine and he was in good spirits. But the morning of July 2nd, he got up very early. Mary was sleeping in the master bedroom up on the upper level of the house, and Hemingway went down, got his favorite shotgun and his ammunition, walked through the living room, went into the vestibule of the house. He put the butt of the gun on the floor, the barrels to his forehead, put his toes against the trigger, and pressed them. This is Papa's final resting place. He's there with Mary, his two of his three sons. He's there with Gregory and Jack and a granddaughter. That's the visit to Papa's places. Thank you. Good night.
Nancy, thank you. We've got a little bit of a delay on the live stream, so the questions are going to start coming in. Could you talk a little bit about how you came to be interested in Hemingway and your journey of learning so much about him and sharing it with others?
Well, I taught American literature at Oak Park High School many years ago, and my students said, "Oh, Hemingway has such an interesting life," and they were like, "School's kind of boring." And at that time, I mean, this was 30, 40 years ago, I went down to the high school library and I pulled the yearbook from 1917, and it was those pictures that I showed tonight. And I showed it to my class, and I said, "Look, this is what he did when he was here. You don't just suddenly flip a page and have an interesting life. He was on the football team, the swimming team, he was in the orchestra, he was the editor of the school newspaper. He didn't just all of a sudden walk into an interesting life. So that was meaningful to me. And then I had this information, and eventually I wound up on the board of the Oak Park Hemingway Foundation, and that enabled me to go to those conferences in Europe, or in Cuba. So I've been to Cuba 8 times. 3 of the times were to conferences where I gave presentations on the Oak Park Hemingway. And then I was able to lecture on cruise ships going to Cuba. That was more recent.
And can you talk about how you became interested in sharing his story specifically through his homes and the places that he spent a lot of time? Because I think this was a really interesting approach to it.
Well, I've been fortunate to be in all the places that he lived. I have stood in the room where he was born and in the vestibule where he ended his life. And I've been in all the places in between. So I spent a large part of my adult life in Oak Park River Forest. And so when I wrote my book, I had a pretty good understanding of the Oak Park mentality. And when I first went to Cuba, the scholars that were from Europe were just like, "Oh, you're from Oak Park? Oh, he hated it there, didn't he?" And I thought, wait a minute, no, he got a good education there, and he learned to do things there. He had this Midwestern work ethic. And so the fire in my belly for writing that book was to say, hey, he had some really good influences here. And so that started that journey. My husband and I also lived in Switzerland for about 5 years. And so I'd spent a lot of time in Paris, and I knew that road where he had gone skiing the first time. And it's a road with a million little hairpin turns, and I knew Les Avants was up there. I was sure that we'd get there, and we were driving up this road. My husband was like, "No, there's nothing up here." I'm like, keep going, keep going. And then we finally saw that sign that said Les Avants Chambly, and that's where he went. And it's filled with these beautiful little Swiss chalets, and the whole idea of a farewell to arms in those scenes where they're up in the mountains comes to life when you go to these different places. And so then, that led to trips to Key West, trips to Cuba. And, of course, Ketchum, I knew because I worked here when I was in college and loved Ketchum Sun Valley. So it's great to be back.
We have a comment from John, and this is kind of thinking about another angle from which to look at Hemingway. He says, the book, Everybody Was So Young, has some interesting insight into Hemingway from the angle of his friends, how he was seen by those who liked him and those who didn't. Are you familiar with that book at all?
Well, I'm familiar with that book, and of course it comes out in A Sun Also Rises. It's very dangerous to be a friend of Ernest Hemingway's because you're going to wind up in a book. And so, 2 examples. One would be Sun Also Rises, where he writes about the lost generation. And they're promiscuous, they drink a lot, they fight, and the people, these characters that are in this book, recognize themselves. They know who they are as individuals that he met in Paris. And so he takes these people and then he kind of puts a little spin on them. Another one is the nurse that I mentioned that he fell in love with when he was in the hospital in Milan, Agnes von Krowski. She becomes the model for Catherine Barclay in A Farewell to Arms. Well, in A Farewell to Arms, they're having sex in the hospital. She becomes pregnant. And poor Agnes von Krowski spends the rest of her life saying, yeah, I was his nurse, but nothing happened. So, again, there was this little basis of reality, but he puts a twist on it. So, yeah, it's dangerous to be his friend.
And then David has a question about your time here. Have you found anything in the Ketchum house that was new or surprising to you?
Well, I've been in the Ketchum house a number of times, but it has been a wonderful experience to just spend time there and just to think about the daily routine that Hemingway had. And I know that he tried to write in the morning. This was a time when he was struggling with writing, so he would try to write in the morning. He'd go to the post office about 10:30 or 11, and then he'd go hunting with his friends in the afternoon. So I've had a lot of conversations with people who wanted to tell hunting stories. Because here, like everywhere else, he made a lot of friends. He was a good storyteller. But just spending time in that house, it's very isolated. It's beautiful. But it was a dark time in his life, and it's I mean, I'm not lonely, but you could be lonely there because it's very quiet. And as lovely as it is, he was alone there and struggling there. So I think I have a new appreciation for that.
And then I think we'll do just a few more. Betsy is wondering if Ketchum is the only place in the American West that Hemingway spent time, and if you could speak to what his impression of the American West was.
Well, he also did his impression of the American West was based on his love of the outdoors and hunting. So he also spent time in Wyoming. So again, this is part of that living in two-place lifestyle. He would come to the American West pretty much during the Cuba years, first to Wyoming and then to Ketchum, Sun Valley. And as I said, he was invited to Sun Valley because he was a well-known author, and Gene Van Gelder knew he loved to hunt. So he would go here, and he'd go out to the Silver Creek area and hunt for duck, hunt for pheasants. They had this trap shooting practice where they'd shoot at magpie. He'd shoot clay pigeons up the north side of his house. And he loved the outdoors, so it was part of his culture. And I must say, you know, I've given a lot of time to researching his four wives, and I have another talk on Hemingway's women. And the women that he married all bought into this program. I mean, Hadley learned to ski, and Pauline bought into living in Key West. Martha came out here, and you know, the first three women were all from St. Louis. Martha came out to Sun Valley. You see pictures of her with hunting and riding horses. And then Mary, his fourth wife, certainly did too. I mean, she liked to hunt and fish, and she knew when she married Ernest Hemingway that she would have to give up her career in journalism and be Mrs. Hemingway, and she did. She bought into that program. And she was actually the one wife that put into her will that she wanted to be buried next to him.
Well, we'll have to have you back to share that presentation sometime soon.
It's hard to do it in an hour.
I know. It's hard to talk about Hemingway in an hour, period. For our last question, and then I'll let you close us out, could you share what you're working on while you're here in Ketchum this trip, and kind of what you're looking forward to in your work?
Well, thank you, Martha. I have been very interested in the final years of Hemingway's life. The scholars have sliced and diced all of his literature. A lot has been written about his literature. A lot has been written about his early life. There are pros and cons about his mother. But when it comes to the final years, there are some unknowns. And so because I was at the community library earlier, and because I worked in Sun Valley during my college days, I knew that there were people left in Sun Valley that knew Hemingway during the last years of his life. And I just felt absolutely compelled to try to pin that down, to see, was he being followed by the FBI? Was he suffering from depression? What did his friends see? What did they feel? And it's interesting talking to people. Everyone is very kind to Hemingway, very protective of him. He was clearly a storyteller. He loved to eat. He loved to drink. He loved to go hunting. He held a lot of parties at Trail Creek, which is one of the places where I worked. And so when you talk to people in Ketchum, they loved Papa. But that's true too in Cuba and in Paris and in parts of Oak Park. So he certainly was a citizen of the world. And I think one of the realizations I have about living in that house is how flexible he was. Because when you get up in the morning in Ketchum and you look out on the Wood River, it's different from looking out the window in Key West or Cuba or Paris or any of the other places he's lived. And he was a citizen of the world, and he loved people and he loved life. And it's really been an honor to be the writer in residence, and I'm very grateful to the community library for the experience. Thank you.